Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with journalist and author Rachel Shabi and leader writer at the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley. There they are. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Observer leads on the Prime Minister's surprise visit to Kiev today to meet the Ukrainian president, where he pledged to send 120 armoured vehicles to help counter Russia's military offensive. It comes as NATO reveals plans to deploy a permanent, full-scale military force on its border. That's on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. The Sunday Express echoes President Zelensky's words to Boris Johnson in its headline, "Welcome to Kiev, my friend." The Times leads on Rishi Sunak's wife, stating that Sunak has moved his family out of Downing Street following this week's story. And this is the Sunday Mail. It covers the incredible story of a war veteran who drove 3,000 miles to help his pregnant daughter-in-law in Ukraine. The Mirror alleges that the Coronation Street actor Simon Gregston was questioned by police outside a pub near the Grand National Racecourse. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discuss them. And as I was saying, we're joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. Rachel and Tim, thanks a lot for joining us. So, the big news, Boris Johnson in Kiev. Rachel, do you want to give us your reaction to that?
Yeah, this is, it's a really powerful story, actually. I'm not a huge fan of Boris Johnson, as I may have mentioned once or twice, but, you know, credit where it's due. This is an incredible move. The visuals on it, the images coming out of Boris Johnson meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky and walking through the streets of Kiev are just incredibly powerful, defiant, bold. It's a real show of solidarity. And the statements that Boris Johnson made on that trip echo that solidarity. But it has to be said as well that it's not just the visual here. Boris Johnson in the UK is credited by the Ukrainian president and the wider population for its efforts and support for Ukraine, particularly in the sort of military hardware that has been supplied to the nation as it defends itself against this horrific illegal invasion from Russia. And that does seem to be something that is echoed amongst the wider Ukrainian population as well. That's something that British journalists pick up on as they report from that country. But this was a closely kept secret, apparently, this trip. And I think the images that it has produced are incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I think we all found out about it because of a tweet, didn't we? Tim, what do you think about it? And I want to look at something the Prime Minister said. He said, Ukraine has defied the odds and pushed back Russian forces from the gates of Kiev, achieving the greatest feat of arms of the 21st century. Do you think that that is actually what's happened here?
I don't know. It's far too early to say. One thing that the trip itself suggests is that Kiev is a little more secure than it was. And it does look as though Putin has pulled back. He has shuffled his military, and he wishes to focus instead upon capturing more ground in the Donbass region. So there is reason to hope, but I think we should probably assume Russia's not going to give in, that it's going to continue a war of attrition. This new general who's come in is notorious for bombing Aleppo into submission. We should assume that this is a long fight. And the question is, what are the conditions for a ceasefire? What looks like winning and what looks like losing? I'm not quite sure what the answer is to that. Right now, Britain keeps reasserting that Putin must lose. Well, what does that mean, apart from pulling his troops out of the country? Does it mean surrendering any kind of Russian presence in the breakaway parts of the eastern part of Ukraine? Does it mean giving up Crimea? What does Putin losing look like? So I'm not quite sure yet what the terms for victory or defeat actually are.
Rachel, what do you think? I can see you nodding there.
Yeah, I think that Tim's absolutely right. It really is unclear what the terms of the end will be, or indeed when it will come. I think what has transpired over the last few weeks, as we've seen Russia's increasingly horrific attacks on Ukraine, and some of the images and stories that have come out over the last few weeks have been just absolutely grotesque in their savagery. But what we've seen over the last few weeks is number one, that Ukraine has been able to show much better resistance to this horrific invasion than perhaps was expected initially, not just because its military is capable and well equipped, but also because its civilians are rising up to defend the country. But also, secondly, that Russia isn't as good militarily and in terms of strategy as we perhaps thought it might be. It's clunky, it's making mistakes. Its soldiers are, conscripts who are young and uninformed and not particularly experienced. And so those two factors have changed the dynamics on the ground. But that being said, none of that takes away from the fact that this is an overwhelming use of force in an entirely illegal invasion that is having absolutely devastating consequences on Ukraine, using the same sort of besiege, starve, and terrorize population strategies that actually we saw Russia using in Syria a few years ago.
Exactly. And that is, Tim, you also mentioned Syria, that is the worry, isn't it? That perhaps the worst is yet to come. And when this second offensive, the second wave starts, that we'll see Putin use even more of what he has. Tim, do you think that possibly the only positive, or one of the very few positives, is what the Sunday Telegraph have really honed in on, and that there will be this full-scale NATO military force to defend the borders, and that even though Putin obviously did not want this to happen, NATO has never been so united?
I should add one positive, of course, as Rachel has suggested, is that Ukraine has really gained a sense of itself in the course of this fight. It's not just that Ukraine has held because of the flow of arms and money, it's also because the Ukrainian people put up a far stronger resistance than Putin or perhaps many outsiders would have suggested. But another positive outcome, as you say, is that the West is now more united and more clear-sighted about the dangers posed both by Russia and also China than it was before. We're starting to see sanctions. We're starting to see the West decouple from the Russian energy market. And in an interview with the Telegraph, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of the NATO, tells us that NATO is united, that it recognizes the challenge has changed, and that it is now going to shift dramatically away from what is called a tripwire strategy, whereby NATO would station a few troops along the Russian border so that if Russia attacked a member state, that would trigger NATO's response. That strategy is now going to be replaced by a strategy of deterrence or defense. In other words, that NATO will actually put an army on the Russian border capable of repelling the Russians. That's a dramatic change in strategy. And of course, the only way it can be done is if NATO members spend a lot more on defense and increase their number of soldiers and military hardware, etc. So Stoltenberg is trying to encourage members now not just to hit the target of spending 2% of your GDP on defense, but actually going above that target. Which, by the way, if they do that, countries will start to leave Britain behind. For instance, Germany has recently agreed to increase its defense spending to 2%. And because Germany has a larger economy than Britain's, that means that it's going to actually excel in terms of defense spending what Britain's currently spending. And we are actually projected right now to cut the number of troops. Our RAF is lacking a certain number of fast jets. The Navy is lacking a certain number of battle-ready warships. So in other words, there's probably going to be a new arms race. I'm not sure that's a good thing necessarily because, frankly, arms races are a horrific waste of money and resources, but it's probably a necessary thing. And as you suggest, it's an unforeseen consequence of Putin's actions. He thought Ukraine would surrender. He thought the West, as it did in 2014, would take minimal action. Instead, you're seeing the beginnings of a second Cold War.
I'm just going to ask Rachel, given what we've seen in Kramatorsk yesterday, those horrific pictures and stories coming out of Bucha and other areas, do you think it's enough? Do you think that morally it's enough that NATO is going to, spend a huge amount and put a force on its borders? Do you not think that perhaps now the time has come in for us to go in and look after the civilians of this country?
you know, that is that's quite a loaded question. I mean, morally, of course, all of us look at these images with absolute revulsion. The horrors that have been rained down on the people of Ukraine are just absolutely horrendous and unimaginable. The conversation amongst NATO countries, and you know, this interview, the Telegraph interview with the NATO chief, comes a couple of days after NATO countries, foreign ministers plus Ukraine got together to discuss what to do. And it's absolutely correct that the unintended consequence of this war has been to revamp and reboost NATO, with some other countries such as Sweden and Finland now wanting to join as well. But there is a very big difference between being a defensive operation and an offensive operation. And I think NATO is very, very careful, is trying to be careful to maintain that line on the defensive side, because the offensive line would tip it into a much greater war. We would be dragged into actually another Cold War, and that would be a completely different order of things entirely, especially when we're dealing with a nuclear country such as Russia.
Indeed, and the Ukrainian people continue to pay that cost. Rachel and Tim, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back, because coming up, the Telegraph reports that an unexpected poll has said the majority of young people would back Marine Le Pen in the French elections against Emmanuel Macron. Back in a moment. Hello again, you're watching the press preview. With me again are the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and leader writer at the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley. Hello again to you both. We kept it Ukraine in the first half. Let's move on now. Let's bring up the front of the Observer. And Tim, why don't you talk us through Rishi Sunak's and his hopes of becoming PM? Does he still have any?
This has been his week from hell. After the revelation that his wife was non-domiciled, and then followed by the revelation that he had a green card in the US, he's really been politically shaken by this. His wife has now moved out of number 11, taking the two daughters with them. He will continue to work above the shop, but will commute at weekends to their house in West London. This is highly unusual for someone to move out of Downing Street while they're still employed in it. So many people are saying that the man who once seemed most likely to take over as PM, partly because of the rave reviews he got for his handling of the pandemic, particularly furlough, it now looks as though his star is coming crashing down into the sea. And I think the reason why he might be brought down over this, why he might either have to resign or choose to resign because he wishes to protect the privacy of himself and his family, is because the British, by and large, will forgive scandals related to sex and personal morality. They can't stand the rich. And it's not, no, I know Rachel will disagree. I know this isn't just a question about his private wealth. It's about how it's handled, and it's about conflicts of interest. Nonetheless, I do think that money scandals cut through in ways that sex and personal scandals don't. And that's partly because people right now are personally, financially suffering, partly as a consequence of government policy. Rishi Sunak would say that the policies he's implementing, like raising national insurance, are things forced upon him by the pandemic. Nonetheless, whether what he was doing was legal or not, whether you privately think it was ethical or not.
I'm going to jump in, Tim, because we've only got half a minute. So let's give Rachel a say. It's true. It seems true what Tim says. They can't stand the rich.
I think wealth is fine, but abusing your wealth and then having one rule for the wealthy and one rule for the other, for everyone else, is a completely different thing. And that's what's been so gobsmacking about Rishi Sunak and his green card status and his wife's tax affairs. It's just extraordinary that the man who's imposing such punitive tax rises on us.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm sorry. We'll leave it at extraordinary, shall we? But Tim and Rachel, we'll see you in the next half hour. Thank you.